Okay, you saw the thumbnail. Let me go ahead and get right into it and telling you why the tech boomers of our generation are totally wrong about frame gen. I'm going to be going over a couple of different titles with a couple of different engines, so there's definitely not going to be any bias with that. And I'm going to provide you guys hardcore evidence as to why frame gen actually might be giving you the best experience in modern day titles. Recently, a lot of games have been experiencing a phenomena where once you enable frame generation, you get lower latency as a result. And that's with reflex enabled in both scenarios. And of course, a lot of games also kidnap reflex, where you can't activate it on the menu unless frame gen is already active, which activates reflex anyway. And also, don't get me wrong, I'm not naive about the flaws of frame generation, where it can actually increase your latency in certain scenarios and where it can cause disturbing visual artifacts, especially if your frame rate is too low. And it's not just an overall boost in performance. It's not a substitute for just getting more raw frame rate, but if it is used correctly, it can give you a better experience while playing your games. Now, I'm going to be using an RTX 5090 for this demonstration, but don't kill me in the comments. I know not everyone can get a 5090 right now, or maybe you shouldn't get a 5090 because of the ridiculous pricing, but these principles can be applied to any RTX 50 series card. Alright, so let's get on with the tests. Alright, so I want to take a minute to go over my Nvidia App Settings for what I'm using. As far as drivers, is the latest driver, which is 596.36, and this is the driver that enhanced smoothness when DLSS frame generation is used with Vsync. Not an overall topic for this video, but it is something nice, and this driver seems to be pretty stable. So my global settings are as follows. I have the DLSS override presets to recommended, and all this stuff is off. I have low latency mode set to on. It is not set to ultra. And skipping down to sync options, I have G-Sync enabled, and I also have, for this test, Vsync off. I'm going to get into Vsync a little bit later and as to why you should be using Vsync when you are playing your games, but not when you're testing your games. Alright, so I have CyberPunk 2077 loaded up here, the tried and true benchmark test of our entire generation. And we're going to be going over the settings just real quick. I have everything basically set to the highest preset, but I'm going to start with ray tracing off and path tracing off, and all this junk off too, except for depth of field and lens flare. And everything else is just basically set to its highest setting, except for spin space reflections, which for some reason takes a ton of performance away from you. And of course, we're going to be playing at a resolution of 4K. And I'm going to put full screen on just because you can squeak out just a little bit more performance when you use full screen. And just keep notice here, reflex low latency is on. So I'm going to first turn it off so we can get a baseline of what the latency is. Okay guys, so you're going to get about 60 to I guess 70 frames per second here in this scene with a whole bunch of traffic and a whole bunch of cars moving around. And again, this is with RT off and path tracing off at 4K with all the other settings at the basically ultra preset. And as you can see, we're getting a latency reading up at the top of your screen for about 80 milliseconds. 80 milliseconds is pretty sluggish, not the snappiest performance. And I'm going to do a keyboard test of jumping, if you guys can just listen in and hear that. Yes, as you can tell from listening in on that sound to when V takes a jump, there's a little bit of a delay there. Okay, so now let's put reflex on just to see what that is going to do for our input lag. Okay, now I'm back in game, and now as you can see, we are getting at about 37 or 36 milliseconds of input delay, and that's much better. Let's do the keyboard test. Yeah, so as you guys can see, that's a much better response time. But if you take a look at our GPU utilization up at the top left corner of your screen on my overlay, you can see it's at about 99%. So when you have a GPU limited scenario, what's actually happening is you are creating a frame rate backlog in your game's render queue. Basically what that means is the GPU is 100% busy and cannot keep up with the requests from the CPU. So frames are actually getting queued up in the render pipeline. And usually when that happens, you're going to get a much larger input lag measurement. All right, so we're going to keep reflex on, and then we're going to enable frame generation. We're still using native 4K here. And yep, like I said, all of this stuff is off. So frame gen, there you are. All right, so we're going to activate frame gen. We're going to have to restart, so I'll see you in a second. Okay, so we're back in our game, and now we're going to take a look at DLSS balanced. And I'm going to show you exactly what is happening. And just as a reminder, reflex is still on. It's actually locked on because frame gen is active. And right now we are getting about 200 frames per second, just about. And latency is at a really quick 28 milliseconds, as you can see at the top center of the screen. And we're going to do a keyboard test just to confirm that. Yeah, that's really snappy. You can definitely tell that really near instant response time there with the keyboard. And as I move around on the screen, as I tap the keys, it is very snappy, very responsive. Absolutely no complaints there. All right, so as you can see at the top left side of the screen, the GPU utilization is at 96%. Don't forget that, because I'm going to take off frame generation and we're going to go into just regular DLSS balanced. All right, so now we're going to take off frame generation, and I do not need to do a restart. And we're going to get back into our game here. And now we're back at 120 frames per second. GPU utilization is at 97%, so it's getting closer to max. And just keep in mind, I do have OBS active right now, so that is taking up a little bit of the GPU resources to record this. But check out the latency. Latency is now over 30 milliseconds, 32, 30, 33. Before we were getting 26, 28. So yes, frame gen can reduce your latency. I know, it's crazy, but it's not a bug. The reason why this is happening is because DLSS upscaling can reduce the load on your GPU so that reflex can work better. And as you can see, once the GPU utilization drops down to 95, you can see the latency actually go down. But once it gets back up to 97, the latency goes back up into the 30s. You can actually see that live happening right now. So that's exactly why this is happening. And I'm going to go over another title, so we'll get into that now. Okay, so now I have Forza Horizon 6 loaded up here. And once again, we're at a resolution of 8K, frame rate unlocked. And we are going to do DLSS on balance mode once again. Actually, I'm going to start at DLAA. And put that on here, and we are going to just basically get a baseline, and I'm going to show you the same thing again. As far as graphic settings, we're going to be basically using the RT Extreme preset. The only thing I have turned off is going to be the screen space reflections on the cars. I do have that off. Honestly, to me, I can't really tell too much of a difference. You get a little bit sharper reflections, but it really does hog your frame rate. But anyways, let's get into the benchmark. All right, so as you guys can see, we're getting at about 70 frames per second on this benchmark test. And if you check out our latency, and this is measuring basically the PC latency. So the game does measure a slightly different metric. It's a different average, but you'll be able to see consistent dropping in latency as we've been discussing. So at about 66 milliseconds on average, and this is at native, and of course the GPU is maxed out. Now let's just go ahead and skip to the end. Okay, so as you guys can see, we got an average of 69 frames per second. Now it says benchmark inaccurate, but don't worry about that because I did alt tab for a second. But the average latency is 41.4 milliseconds, and the GPU limited percentage is at 100%. So just keep that in mind. All right, so let's go into the next benchmark once we activate FrameGen. Okay, so I'm turning FrameGen 2X on, and Reflex has been on the whole time. Okay, and now we are getting about 120 frames per second in the benchmark scene here. And as you can see, latency went down approximately 20 milliseconds. That is huge. And that is because, as you'll see on the end screen, GPU limited percentage dropped from 100% to 34. And the average PC latency dropped from about 41 to 27. So on both ends, whether you're looking at the Nvidia overlay or the in-game latency metric, you are getting a reduction in latency once FrameGen is active. So all the doom tubers, the boomer tubers as I want to call them now, that keep telling you, oh, FrameGen is terrible, it's gonna give you so much input lag, it's so sloppy, it's so harsh. They need to update their worldview because that was old and this is now. So I'm gonna show you guys even more evidence. I'm gonna put DLSS to the quality setting and I'm gonna take frame generation off. And we're getting about 96, 97 frames per second right now. Latency is hovering around 49 to 50 milliseconds. And once again, we can see the GPU limited percentage is at about 99%. Average PC latency on the benchmark is 29.7. Remember those numbers. All right, so now let's activate FrameGen. Okay, so now we got frame generation active and we're getting about 169, 170 frames per second. And as you can see, the latency on screen from Nvidia overlay dropped down to the 30s. And now I'm gonna fast forward till the end. And as you can see, the average latency dropped another 4 to 5 milliseconds, so it's about 22 milliseconds. But here is the key. GPU limited percentage dropped all the way down from 99 point whatever it was down to 24. That is why you do get better latency with FrameGen. Boomers, please update your worldview. Okay, and now I have Samson loaded up here, and this is an Unreal Engine 5 title, a recent title that just came out in 2026. And I'm gonna go over our, let's see, windowed full screen. Let's just do full screen. And we are going to use DLSS at native just to start our test here. Ray reconstruction, I'm gonna take that off. Frame generation is off and reflex is enabled. Everything is going to be set to ultra for this test. Motion blur off, film grain off, and come on. All right, let's get into it. Okay, so we just loaded up the game here in 4K native, and as you can see, the frames per second are about 63, 64, 67. So let's just call it in the 60s. And the latency reading from the Nvidia app is showing 50 milliseconds of input delay. About 51, 52, just dipped down to 49. And now we are going to just activate FrameGen. Let's see, FrameGen, we're going to put that onto 2x, hit confirm. Let's bring up our overlay back. And as you can see, once again, latency dropped tremendously. It dropped tremendously down to 43, 40 to 39 milliseconds. And once again, look at the top left side of your screen. The GPU utilization is down. This is where you want to be when you're playing a game. You don't want to be at 99% GPU usage. That's not good. When you're at 99, 100% GPU usage, you're actually looking at a previous state of the game at the end of your render queue. No one's talking about this for some strange reason. All right, so let's go to upscaling. So we're going to switch it over to DLSS quality, and we're going to put off frame generation, confirm, reflex is still enabled. And now we're getting about 80 in the frame rates, and latency is at about 42 milliseconds. So it was basically where it was at native. with FrameGen. But as you can see, the GPU usage is now lowered. It's between 92 and 95%. And now I'm going to activate frame generation, and we're probably not going to see as big as of a reduction as we did see at native, because that GPU usage is already down. So let's see here, 2x enabled, back. Yeah, okay. Yep, so it's like this is what I thought. It's at roughly the same latency as it was before. Actually, no, it did reduce it by a couple milliseconds. It's in the 30s. But this is still really good, and you're able to boost your frame rates, and once it's already high, like 60 to 80 frames per second base, it's going to be really hard to detect artifacts. And especially now that we have frame generation preset B, it's going to be even harder because that was tuned to stabilize HUD elements and things of that nature. Now, as I said before at the beginning of the video, you are actually supposed to play with Vsync on, because that's going to give you the smoothest frame pacing for your experience, but you're not supposed to use it right at the edge of your monitor's refresh rate limit. And I'm going to show you that, because Vsync actually is very light once you're a couple of frames below your frame rate, your refresh rate limit. And Nvidia knows this. That's why they programmed Reflex to cap your frame rate a couple of frames below that. So I'm going to show you another test here, and this one is going to be in Alan Wake 2. Alright, so we're also going to be using Riva tuning to cap the frame rates, and actually that's what everyone should be doing. You should never just let your GPU run wild and get the usage all the way up to 100%. So just going over our options here, everything is going to be at 4K, and I'm just going to use the high preset for ray tracing. Everything is set to high, and let's get into our test. So yeah, I'm going to use DLSS quality because 4K is really good experience, and FrameGen is going to be off for the test for now. Okay, so I have everything loaded up here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into Riva Tuner really quickly and just use a frame rate limit. And by the way, I do have the frame rate limiter set to Nvidia Reflex, as you can see here. And I'm going to put it at a 58 frames per second cap. Alright, so let's see, that should work. And yes, we are at 58 frames per second. Perfect. So this is actually going to give you a completely smooth frame time. As you can see, it's frame time graph is really smooth. But if you check out the latency is at about 56 milliseconds, 57, around there. GPU usage is sitting comfortably at 70%, so Reflex is able to run wild. But this is again one of those games where Reflex is kidnapped inside of frame generation. But just take this for what it's worth. So 58 stable frame rate, and as you can see, I'll put my frame rate numbers up here. 1% lowest is at about 53, 54. So yeah, that's really smooth frame pacing. Now let's activate FrameGen and see what happens. Alright, so I'm going to put frame generation 2x on here. So now we're able to get up to 116 frames per second, and what do you know? Latency is actually a little bit lower with your cap moved up to 120. So frame generation is able to work with Reflex and give you the absolute best result. So hope you guys got some value out of this video, and tell a friend that frame generation is not sluggish experience. You do have to optimize your settings because you do want to be at that 60 frames per second limit. You want to try to get between 60 to 70, and then you're probably going to see frame generation reduce your overall latency. Anyway, that's it for this video. See you all in the next one. Peace out.